Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into what is, I think, one of the great intellectual turnabouts of the last century. We're talking about the spectacular and very politically consequential return of a global force that academia had confidently and, well, entirely prematurely declared dead.
It really is the story of a massive blind spot. I mean, for decades, particularly if you look at the powerful Western academic institutions, the consensus in political science was pretty simple.
And what's that?
Ignore religion. Just don't touch it.
Yeah.
The prevailing theory of modernization, of secularization, suggested that faith was a private thing.
A relic.
A nostalgic relic, exactly. Something that was certain to be washed away by global progress. It just wasn't considered a serious variable in the study of power or governance or, international conflict.
And we have a really comprehensive analysis here that details the fallout from that. I mean, it was a colossal oversight. This gap in the research became so glaring, so fundamentally problematic for understanding the new global landscape.
But they had no choice.
Right. Scholars were eventually forced to organize themselves and, effectively, invent a brand new area of study just to catch up.
That's it. So our mission today for you is to map the emergence of this critical field. Some people call it the politology of religion.
Or more straightforwardly, the political science of religion.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to trace that historical misstep. We're going to analyze the intellectual earthquakes that really forced this change. And crucially, map out the expansive and, frankly, very complex research territories this new discipline has now claimed.
And before we jump in, let's just frame this with the central paradox that I think defines the whole journey. We're talking about the deep irony that the very forces political scientists bet on to kill religion's public influence.
So things like technological modernization,
Deepening globalization, increased connectivity.
all the things that were supposed to make the world more rational and secular.
Right. And those very things actually led to a profound increase in religion's significance in the global public sphere. It has become a crucial, and in many places, a primary source of political legitimacy and identity worldwide.
So to really appreciate why studying religion politically is so necessary now, we first have to internalize the sheer extent of the academic neglect in the 20th century. It wasn't just, ignorance.
No, it was more than that.
It was an active rejection of religion as a legitimate explanatory factor.
Our analysis confirms this was the consensus for pretty much the whole century, and it was driven largely by post-Enlightenment thinking. You have leading Western social thinkers just operating on this core assumption.
That complex modern society was necessarily rational and therefore secular.
The foundational belief here was that these older communities, ethnic, national, or especially religious ones, they just didn't matter anymore in the modern era, or at least they shouldn't.
Right. So if you were trying to find rational explanations for global mechanisms, things like trade agreements, military deterrence, how states are formed, anything related to the sacred, the transcendental.
For just ultimate conviction.
All of it was simply tossed into a separate box. A box that was, often methodologically untouchable. You couldn't study it properly, so you just didn't.
In this intellectual framework, it was deeply rooted in a geographical bias, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Political science research was so heavily concentrated on North America and Western Europe.
Right, the places where secularization, particularly among the educated elite, was most advanced.
Exactly. So the assumption was that the Western trajectory of modernization, industrialization, secularization was a universal linear predictor.
Yeah.
The argument was, if it happened here, where we are rational and advanced, it must eventually happen everywhere else.
It's a kind of rest of the world will catch up theory.
It is. They saw the religious factor in places like Africa, the Middle East, or Asia as just a temporary lag. Something that would soon be overcome by inevitable economic progress. And this deeply ethnocentric view meant they failed to invest any serious academic capital in understanding global religious political mobilization. They just didn't think it was worth their time.
So we have this philosophical blind spot, and it's combined with a geographical tunnel vision. But the sources also highlight something else, that the prevailing methodologies actively enforce this exclusion. It wasn't just that they didn't want to study religion.
It was that they felt they couldn't study it, not with their favorite tools anyway.
Okay, that's a crucial technical point. Let's break that down.
Well, consider the dominant research paradigms of the era. First, you have the behavioral approach.
Right.
This methodology insisted on focusing only on observable political actions, things you could count.
Like voting records, policy decisions, troop movements.
Precisely. It reduces political actors to these self-interested, rational utility maximizers. Now, how do you fit a concept like eternal salvation or a divine mandate into that framework?
You can't. It doesn't compute.
You can't. The deepest convictions that drive religious political action, this idea of a sacred worldview, are precisely what the behavioral approach systematically filters out. It filters them out because they are not easily observable or quantifiable.
So if the model can't measure it, the model assumes it either doesn't exist or at least that it doesn't matter.
That's it in a nutshell. And then secondly, in international relations, the dominant perspective was realism,
Which focuses on the state.
almost exclusively. Realism sees the state as the primary actor, and it's concerned with power, military capacity, and security. Because religious organizations rarely acted like traditional state entities, I mean, they often bypass borders, realism it largely missed them.
That really does sound like a fundamental flaw in the realist model, especially when you're confronted with modern globalization.
It is a massive flaw. Globalization meant that religious influence increasingly manifested through what we now call transnational religious organizations, or TROs.
So you're thinking of, what, the Catholic Church, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Exactly, or global evangelical networks. These TROs, they operate outside the traditional state-centric framework. They can mobilize people, resources, and ideology across borders without needing an army or, a seat at the UN.
And the old model just couldn't track these non-state actors.
It was blind to them. And that led to massive intelligence failures, massive academic failures, when, for instance, faith groups intervened in civil conflicts or generated major political movements that seemed to come out of nowhere.
So for decades, political science had a methodology that was too narrow to capture the spiritual drive, and then an international theory too focused on states to see the global networks of faith. It left them completely unprepared.
Totally unprepared for the resurgence of public religion. And that's why the paradigm shift was so necessary and so sudden. The complexity of the global environment today, the rise of faith-based movements, the role of religious identity in conflict, the political mobilization around sacred law, it's all proven that the relationship between religion and politics is far from diminishing.
If anything, it's growing.
It is, in fact, increasingly significant and complex worldwide, and the numerical increase we see in academic work on this topic, it's basically an emergency response. It's trying to cover the deficit created by 50 years of theoretical denial.
Okay, so what was the inflection point? What was that moment when the intellectual dam finally broke and forced political scientists to abandon this long-held secularization premise?
The sources are very clear on this. It was a fundamental geopolitical shift, and it was catalyzed by the end of the Cold War.
Right. The collapse of the Soviet Union.
The fall of the bipolar system in 1991, it just created this ideological vacuum. And it demanded new theoretical models to explain international relations. The old paradigms, which were all based on the U.S.-Soviet ideological rivalry, were obsolete overnight.
So everyone was scrambling for a new map.
Everyone. And this, combined with the accelerating processes of globalization, it just necessitated a fundamental reevaluation of what factors truly drove conflict and cooperation and identity in this new world order.
And this reevaluation was instantly framed by what has to be the legendary intellectual slugfest of the 1990s. I'm talking about the competing visions of Francis Fukuyama and Samuel P. Huntington.
These two scholars, they absolutely set the stage for the entire academic restructuring that followed. Let's start with Francis Fukuyama. His work, The End of History, presented this incredibly powerful and really optimistic argument.
He claimed the ultimate triumph of liberal democracy and the market economy. He argued that history, with a capital H, the great struggle between competing ideologies, was basically over.
And his theory divided history into these three great phases. You have the pre-Cold War ideological conflicts, then the transitional phase of collapse, and finally, the final state of affairs where liberal democracy stood as the only viable model left standing.
So in his view, the natural trajectory of human consciousness just led inexorably toward freedom and rational choice.
Which would suggest that these deeply rooted, non-rational factors like religion would indeed decline as global factors. His initial assessment was that ideology itself was dying.
And that must have been a profoundly comforting idea for the Western academic establishment that had been operating under the secularization assumption for so long. It kind of affirmed their entire model.
Oh, absolutely. But reality proved to be much, much messier. And the sources note that even Fukuyama himself had to introduce a massive caveat by the year 2000.
The promised seamless transition to a universal liberal consensus wasn't quite happening.
Not at all. It was being actively challenged by these tenacious variables that resisted absorption.
So what were these variables? What proved too resistant for history's supposed end?
Well, he specifically called out the traditional challengers, like nationalism and ethnic conflicts, and also newer forms of political organization, like Asian soft authoritarianism. But, and this is critical for our discussion, he explicitly named Muslim theocracy as a major competitor.
A non-liberal system.
A non-liberal system capable of generating legitimate governance that was not based on market economics or Western political theory.
That is a fascinating admission. I mean, the man who declared the end of ideological conflict had to turn around and acknowledge that a system based entirely on sacred law, a religious political system, was standing strong as a viable, challenging political model.
It really was. It showed that faith, far from being some private relic, could generate powerful state-level political legitimacy. Legitimacy strong enough to compete with the West's supposed final answer. And this intellectual crack, it opened the door for the opposing and far more religiously focused argument from Samuel P. Huntington.
Right. Huntington presented a dramatically different and much more pessimistic vision in The Clash of Civilizations. His argument essentially resurrected culture as the central organizing principle of global politics.
His core thesis was revolutionary for political science at the time. He said that after the ideological conflicts of the Cold War, the traditional determinants of conflict like economic rivalry or specific government structures would be superseded by fundamental cultural identities.
So global politics, in his view, was becoming multipolar.
Multipolar and multi-civilizational, defined not by states, but by 8 or 9 distinct civilizations.
And he didn't just mention culture, he rooted it specifically in the spiritual dimension.
His definition was utterly unambiguous, and it became the cornerstone of this new paradigm. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Religion is the central element defining civilization."
Wow.
So therefore, the fault lines of future conflict would be defined by civilizational differences, which were derived directly from religious divisions, the divides between Orthodox, Western Christian, Islamic, Sunnic, Hindu civilizations, and so on.
That is a direct, point-blank refutation of the secularization thesis. Instead of religion diminishing, Huntington is arguing it's becoming the ultimate factor, and it's replacing ideology.
Precisely. He argued that the rise of the West led to this mistaken belief that Western values were universal. But when the West attempted to spread its universalist aspirations, democracy, secularism, individual rights, globally.
This triggered pushback.
It triggered pushback, and it exacerbated conflicts with other civilizations who viewed those values as alien and, frankly, as culturally imperialistic. And this pushback often took a powerful, organized religious form.
Now, okay, there's a critical challenge here that we have to address.
Yeah.
Huntington was often criticized for being too reductive, right? Wasn't he accused of simplifying these massive, diverse faith systems like Islam or Christianity into these monolithic civilizations that just inevitably clash?
Yes, and that's a vital point.
So how does the emerging politology of religion move beyond that kind of methodological critique?
That's a great question. The politology of religion does not endorse Huntington's essentialism or his prediction of inevitable conflict. Instead, what it does is it takes his core insight that religion defines political identity, and it makes it a variable for study rather than an unproven assumption.
Okay, so it's the starting point for a question, not the final answer.
Exactly. It forces scholars to analyze the varied manifestations of religion. So, for example, rather than just identifying an Islamic civilization, the field demands an analysis of how different forms of Islam, Sunni, Shia, Sufi, secular fundamentalists are politically mobilized, how they compete with each other, and how they interact with specific state structures.
So this whole debate, Fukuyama versus Huntington, it basically served as a mandate. It told political scientists they could no longer just reject religion based on past theories. They had to formally include it, analyze its nuance, and recognize its global agency.
Absolutely. The inability to understand global processes from, foreign policy failures to domestic culture wars in the New World Order without addressing the religious factor became undeniable. And this realization forced the move from marginalizing faith to making it a central pillar of political research, which of course required a new disciplinary home.
And this realization, it created an academic turf war, really, a kind of identity crisis for this nascent field. If politology of religion is necessary, where does it belong? Is it in the humanities with religious studies, or is it in the social sciences with political science?
And that choice affects everything.
Yeah.
The methodology, the core questions, the whole research focus, it's a fascinating dilemma.
So we need to look at how each of these potential parent disciplines, at least in the academic tradition we are analyzing, staked its claim. The sources show two pretty distinct camps, each with a different primary lens.
Let's start with Camp 1. Politology of religion as a subdiscipline of religious studies. This camp, which is referred to by the Polish term religioznawstwa, often emerged from an academic tradition that was really focused on the history, the culture, and the theology of faith.
And how did they define the field?
Their definition frames it as the study of the relations occurring between the sphere of religion and the sphere of politics. So for them, religion is the primary subject. The goal is to chart how that foundational belief system influences politics, and then how political systems, in turn, affect the religious environment.
So their approach is maybe deeper, more historical.
And less focused on contemporary political mechanisms, yes.
This historical and, I guess, sacral focus is really well illustrated by the huge research agenda that was proposed by Kazimierz Banek, who is a key figure in this approach. His list is just sprawling. It traces political implications back to the very origins of faith itself.
It is. It's a view that sees the entire history of political organization as just deeply intertwined with the sacred. We should probably walk through a few of his proposed research areas to really understand this historical depth.
Okay. First, he focuses on the enormous political influence of great prophets and religious reformers.
Right, so this means studying figures like Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, or even someone like Martin Luther, not just as spiritual leaders, but as radical political transformers. Their teachings redefined social hierarchies, laws, and the relationship between the individual and the state. Their theological vision directly informed governmental legitimacy for centuries.
Next, he looks at the cult of official state deities and religious patrons. This sounds like pure ancient history, but it has modern political implications.
It does. I mean, think about the Roman imperial cult. The divine status of the emperor was a direct tool of political control and territorial unity. Or consider pre-war Japan, where state Shinto established the emperor as a living god, providing unchallengeable legitimacy to militaristic policies. It shows how sacred patrons function as ideological glue for the state.
Banek's third point then addresses the sacred functions of the king and the ruling elite. This speaks to inherited political legitimacy.
This is the whole concept of divine right, the idea that a monarch's authority comes directly from God, making them accountable only to a transcendent power. This framework shaped centuries of European history and dictated internal power structures, often placing the king above any kind of secular or constitutional challenge.
Point 4 is fascinating to me. The political functions of oracles and soothsayers, or diviners.
This emphasizes how, in so many societies, decisions of state-like, whether to go to war, sign a treaty, who succeeds the throne, were not based on some rational cost-benefit analysis. They were based on seeking divine guidance. And you can see remnants of this even today in some traditional societies. It demonstrates that political authority can be, in a sense, outsourced to religious figures who claim sacred knowledge.
Fifth, and this is maybe the most obviously relevant, is the study of religious wars, conflicts, and religiously motivated aggression.
Yeah, this includes exhaustive analysis of conflicts like the Crusades or the 30 Years' War, where the political objective territory, power, is fundamentally inseparable from the religious justification, heresy, salvation, doctrinal supremacy. The field has to categorize and analyze the mechanisms through which religion transitions from a source of comfort to a source of political violence.
Moving on, he also includes religious and politico-religious federations.
This looks at how a shared religion can serve as the basis for a political alliance or transnational cooperation, often bypassing ethnic or national ties. I mean, think about the historical reach of the Catholic Church's political influence in medieval Europe, or the efforts to create pan-Islamic alliances in the modern era.
His seventh point is incredibly powerful and still so relevant to identity politics today. The problem of the chosen people in a religious sense and its connection to nationalism.
This is absolutely crucial for understanding conflicts in the modern era. The religiously sanctioned belief that a particular people are divinely destined for a land or a mission. It provides an ultimate, non-negotiable justification for political claims, for territorial expansion, or for the exclusion of others. You can see examples ranging from elements of manifest destiny in early U.S. history to Zionism or various forms of ethnic nationalism that are bolstered by religious narratives.
Next on his list, he includes political parties explicitly referencing religious principles.
So this means Starting parties where the core platform is built directly on religious doctrine. You see this with specific Islamic parties or older Christian political movements where secular policies are explicitly measured against scriptural or dogmatic standards.
And finally, his ninth area covers the different systems of state-religious organization relations.
This is really the historical scaffolding of church-state relations. It covers everything from theocracy, where the religious institution dominates the state, to state dominance, where the state controls the church, like in Tsarism. And then you have the formal separation model, like in the US or France with laïcité, and specialized agreements like concordats, which are basically treaties between a state and the Holy See outlining mutual jurisdiction.
And our sources confirm Bannock added other crucial historical points, like theocratic states, the secularization of law, and how new religions were often adopted through monarchical decisions. This whole approach, which was reinforced by scholars like Bogumił Grot, it really sees religion as the historical foundational lens through which politics has to be viewed.
That's the key distinction. Grot argued that in 19th and 20th century Europe, all the major ideological currents, even revolutionary socialism or secular liberalism, were defined either by their inspiration from or their rebellion against existing religious influences. For them, religion is the inescapable, defining background radiation of all political dynamics.
Okay, so that gives us a really thorough understanding of the religious studies camp. Now let's flip it. What about Camp 2? Politology of religion as a subdiscipline of political science. Their focus is much more functional, systemic, and modern.
Right. The politologists were quick to affirm the field's necessity, but they insisted it had to be housed within their discipline. The core argument, articulated very well by Maria Marczewska-Rytko, is that religion is not the background. It is simply one of many powerful variables conditioning political ideas, phenomena, and processes, both globally and domestically.
Her emphasis is on the practical, observable dynamics.
Precisely. She stresses the idea of mutual interaction. So sociopolitical systems transform the religious environment, think about state regulation of religious practice, and at the same time, religious processes fundamentally influence social behavior, political actions, and state decisions. Think about religious mobilization against a new law. For her, the political system is the central object of study, and religion is the variable that interacts with it.
And her research areas really reflect this focus on contemporary power mechanisms rather than, ancient prophets. Let's look at a few examples from her list.
Okay, she starts with analyzing religious communities as interest groups and social movements.
So this immediately moves the focus from sacred doctrine to political lobbying.
Absolutely. The question becomes, how effectively does the evangelical movement lobby Congress on specific policies? How does the Catholic hierarchy act as a veto player in abortion debates? How do mosques organize community movements against a local government policy? This is textbook political science, analyzing how non-state actors apply pressure to the political system.
Next, she includes the core modern question, religion and democracy.
This involves analyzing the ways religious values either support democratic institutions by, say, providing moral capital for civil society, or undermine them, for example, by arguing that divine law supersedes constitutional law. It's all about measuring the functional compatibility of faith with pluralistic secular governance.
Our third point is deeply analytical. Secularization, privatization, and then the counter-process, the deprivatization of religion.
This is critical. Secularization means faith leaving the public square, becoming a private matter. Privatization is the act of pushing it out. The deprivatization, the resurgence we're talking about, is the political phenomenon we see today. Religion actors intentionally bringing faith back into lawmaking, public school debates, and foreign policy. This is the act of reclaiming the public sphere, and it has to be studied as a political phenomenon.
And finally, she includes religious fundamentalism as a specific political phenomenon and the analysis of political and religious leadership and religious and political ritualism.
Right. So fundamentalism is analyzed here for its systemic effect, how it attempts to halt or reverse social change through political action. Leadership focuses on the mechanisms of authority. How does a charismatic pastor or an ayatollah transform spiritual legitimacy into political obedience? And ritualism looks at the political function of ceremony, how public prayer or state funerals or religious holiday endorsements reinforce state authority and national identity.
We also see another scholar, R. Michalak, further refining this politological perspective.
Yeah.
He focuses specifically on the nuanced consequences of faith, even when the faith isn't overtly political.
Michael Matrix is incredibly sophisticated in how it analyzes political agency. He looks at, first, religious teaching with direct political content. That's the obvious one, when a sermon explicitly says, vote for candidate X. But then he looks at functional or dysfunctional religious agency in the political sphere. So, how religious institutions succeed or fail in their lobbying efforts.
But then he gets to the really subtle points, like religious behavior or practice, without direct political content, but with direct political consequences. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Imagine a religious group whose theology emphasizes massive charitable giving and a very strict social morality, but it never, ever discusses electoral politics. The political consequence is that this group creates a huge parallel welfare system, which might reduce reliance on state services. Or, conversely, their strict morality generates a significant social conservatism that impacts public health debates, even without any direct political instruction. Their deeply held religious conviction creates a verifiable political outcome.
And he also includes the reverse of that, secular phenomena that lack religious motivation but provoke religious consequences.
This highlights the external pressure on religious groups. A secular government might implement a massive infrastructure project, say, building a highway that requires seizing land currently used as a sacred site or a church cemetery. The motivation is purely economic, but the consequence is powerful religious mobilization and political backlash against the government. This shows the field has to analyze external political factors as well.
It's clear that political scientists are willing to define this field with extreme precision just to claim ownership. And Potts's claim seems to be the most radical argument for this belonging.
Potts argues for the full constitution of politology of religion as a fully fledged subdiscipline of political science. He insists that religiously sanctioned power like a theocracy, which might appear religious on the surface, is at its core a political phenomenon. All elements of religious knowledge, like doctrine and history, are subordinate to the analysis of the political system's functioning: who holds power, how they use it, and how they maintain legitimacy. For him, the question isn't what they believe, but how that belief is converted into systemic governance.
So to synthesize this whole identity crisis, Camp 1 from religious studies uses the lens of faith to understand political systems, focusing on history and sacred roots.
And Camp 2, from political science, uses the functional tools of their discipline to analyze faith as a variable in contemporary power structures.
And the tension between those two views seems necessary for a complete analysis.
This intense internal debate has led to a few major acknowledged research frontiers where the bulk of the work in politology of religion is now concentrated.
Right, so let's explore the 4 areas our sources highlight as being critical for the modern field.
We should begin with Frontier 1, state-church relations. Despite all the new focus on global conflict, this remains the area of foundational research interest.
This is the traditional legal architecture, right? The formal and the practical dimensions of how the state, the church, and various religious communities manage to coexist, especially within legal frameworks.
The research here is exhaustive. It involves these deep dives into constitutional law, how different nations frame religious freedom and the public role of faith, and the analysis of specific instruments like concordats. A concordat, for instance, is a formal treaty between a specific state and the Holy See.
And it defines things like the rights of the church,
The appointment of bishops, and issues like religious education. Studying these requires a specialized knowledge that blends political science, law, and history.
And we see vast differences globally. I mean, if you compare the formalized separation system of France's laïcité, which demands religion be strictly private, with the established state church of the United Kingdom, or the unique interpretation of separation in the United States, it shows the incredibly diverse legal architecture this field has to tackle.
Absolutely. And the ongoing political tensions in these countries, over religious symbols in public schools, government funding for religious institutions, or clergy involvement in political life, these are all core subjects within this frontier. It requires understanding the formal rules, but also the informal, practical power relations that often override the legal text.
Okay, shifting gears dramatically, we arrive at Frontier 2, fundamentalism and global conflict. This is the urgent area, the primary evidence that the whole secularization theory failed.
This area of research just exploded after events like 9/11 and the rise and fall of the so-called Islamic State. It showed that religion could be mobilized into these devastating, globally impactful political forces, operating far outside the predictable models of state-to-state conflict.
And the sources provide a definition of this fundamentalism that clarifies why it is such a unique challenge for political science. It's a willingness to commit violence in the name of religiously motivated visions, using faith to explicitly justify political and social aggression.
And that distinguishes it from other forms of political violence because it rests on a claim of ultimate divine justification. The actors, they often lack the typical scruples associated with secular political violence because they believe they're implementing God's will. But there is a deeper and crucial dimension here, the apocalyptic vision.
Okay, explain that. How does the apocalyptic dimension fundamentally change the political analysis?
Well, traditional political conflict, whether it's ideological or territorial, is ultimately negotiable. If two states are fighting over resources, there's always a compromise point. However, fundamentalists often aspire to the fulfillment of an ultimate, non-negotiable apocalyptic vision, a spiritual end goal they believe will usher in final peace and justice sanctioned by God.
So if political action is just a means to achieving this sacred end goal,
You cannot bargain with it. A political scientist cannot offer a compromise solution when the opponent is fighting for the literal end of history.
so the politology of religion has to analyze how these ultimate spiritual justifications translate into political strategy and mobilization. It makes the study of the underlying theology suddenly essential for security studies.
It forces political science to understand non-rational motivation, which is something the 20th century behavioral approach strictly avoided. This means analyzing recruitment, financing, global networking, and the political systems, like the self-declared caliphate of the Islamic State, that are created by these fundamentalist movements.
Okay, moving on to Frontier 3, religion and democracy. This is about the value-based tension, the dual role that faith plays within modern governance.
This research frontier acknowledges that faith is a double-edged sword for democracy. On one hand, religion can profoundly undermine democratic principles, particularly when specific religious norms challenge secular legal authority, the equality of citizens, or individual rights.
So you're thinking of debates over freedom of speech, separation of genders, or secular curriculum mandates in schools.
Exactly. But the sources also emphasize a critical limitation for the global spread of democracy.
Which is what?
It's that for vast populations around the world, especially where faith is deeply intertwined with cultural identity, liberal democracy may be fundamentally unacceptable if its principles conflict with deeply held religious norms. When your social and political systems are supported by centuries of religious principles, adopting purely secular liberal values can be perceived as an act of cultural and sometimes spiritual destruction.
And that puts a real limit on the universal applicability of Western democratic models.
A huge limit. This frontier also includes essential concepts like civil religion.
Right. What is the political function of civil religion?
Civil religion, a concept often attributed to the sociologist Robert Bellah, describes how a secular state can borrow religious language, symbols, and rituals to foster unity and moral cohesion, even without endorsing a specific doctrine.
So, like American presidents ending speeches with, "God bless America"?
That's a perfect example. Or the use of sacred founding documents and historical figures as moral paragons. It's religion functioning as a social and political unifying agent, rather than a spiritual practice.
And relatedly, the study of religious freedom is crucial here.
Religious freedom defines the boundaries of conscience and worship within the state structure. This area of research looks at the legal, political, and social attempts to draw the line between protected private practice and political action. For example, when does a religious conviction, which is a private matter, become a political act that has to be regulated by the state, like protesting near a hospital? The field is actively tracking these evolving legal and political boundaries all over the world.
Finally, we turn to Frontier 4, ideological currents and political thought. This is about analyzing how faith explicitly translates into formalized political organization, policies, and movements.
This involves detailed analysis of political parties and movements where the religious threads are explicit. And the sources specifically point to the Christian democratic current as a major focus.
This was the movement, originating in 19th and 20th century Europe,
Yeah.
that built political parties explicitly on Catholic social teaching.
Exactly. They advocated for family values, social welfare, and market regulation, all informed by a kind of spiritual morality.
Christian democracy is a great example of a religious political current that became a powerful, mainstream, and often successful political force, really influencing the post-war European consensus.
Absolutely. It demonstrates the sophisticated implementation of religious principles in a political sphere that is nominally secular. And this frontier also examines the role of religion in specific regional and international issues. For instance, the ongoing, very heated debates over European integration and the question of whether the EU should acknowledge its Christian roots, that is a deeply politicological and religious question.
And this includes global security implications as well.
Yes. The analysis of how different faiths influence global security policies, how religious groups are targeted by or integrated into counterterrorism efforts, and how religious diplomacy is used to either mediate or escalate conflicts. It really seeks to understand the implementation of religious principles in every level of the political machine, from voting habits right up to high-level foreign policy strategy.
These four areas, the legal framework, global conflict, democratic compatibility, and ideological manifestation, they really demonstrate the sheer scope required to properly analyze the religious factor in contemporary politics. Hashtag tag outro.
So pulling all these threads together, what have we really learned about the politology of religion? Based on the evidence we've looked at, the academic community's shift is total. The need for this specialized field is now widely accepted, and that marks a complete reversal of the 20th century secularization consensus.
And this field emerged not from some abstract theory, but directly due to massive global changes, the ideological realignment after the Cold War, the effects of globalization, which necessitated new paradigms that finally acknowledged the political agency and the systemic influence of faith.
The dilemma of its identity humanities versus social sciences. That remains, but our analysis suggests a productive dual existence. The politology of religion is likely to develop successfully within both religious studies, which provides that deep contextual and historical knowledge you need to understand sacred motivation.
And within political science, which offers the critical systemic and functional analysis of power mechanisms needed for political critique.
Exactly. This enforced interdisciplinary approach is really the only way to grapple with the profound complexity of the religion factor.
The journey we've mapped out for you today really confirms the field's vast scope. We've gone from Kazimierz Bajnek's vision of studying ancient prophets as state cults and the religious foundations of monarchy, the historical bedrock of power,
all the way to Marczewska-Rytko and Mikulek's vision of analyzing modern ritualism, religious interest groups, and the nuanced political consequences of faith in our contemporary interconnected systems.
And this means the classical focus on state-church relations is now supplemented by these urgent studies on religious legitimacy in every type of regime, democratic, authoritarian, and fundamentally theocratic. The political scientists just can't afford to ignore the sacred source of authority anymore.
That's right.
We started this deep dive by looking at the intellectual catalyst. Huntington argued that traditional factors like ideology and economic potential were losing ground to religion as the central defining element of civilization in the post-Cold War world. If that's true, and if we are now formalizing the intense specialized study of faith's political power through this new subdiscipline, the politology of religion, we have to ask you, is this academic development the ultimate proof that we are witnessing not just the much debated end of history, but the true self-conscious beginning of the age of civilizations?